There is a version of Walt who exists in almost every family. Not the man who never had enough, the man who had enough for years and never noticed, because he never once asked himself what enough actually looked like. He just kept lowering the number. I used to think that was a failure of arithmetic. It isn't. Walt could do arithmetic better than most people I've met. It was a failure of a different kind, the kind where you build an entire structure for growing money and never build the matching structure for knowing when to stop growing it. Two different skills. Nobody tells you that the second one doesn't arrive for free just because you mastered the first. A floor you never set isn't humility. It's a ceiling wearing a disguise. Quick version: if you're new, frugality has a floor, wealth building doesn't. That's video 1. Last time, I gave you the exact order to automate the 6 rungs, 1 through 6, in sequence, so the whole system runs without requiring your willpower on a Tuesday. Most people who write to me after that video ask the same follow-up question, in different words: I've automated everything. Rung 5 is running. Why doesn't it feel finished? That question is what today is about. Today is about one specific failure that can happen at the very top rung, not knowing where your own floor actually is, which means never quite knowing when you're allowed to stop.
Marguerite ran a small accounting practice for 26 years, in a storefront 2 doors down from a hardware store that outlasted 3 different owners while she stayed exactly where she was. Good income, most years, better than good, some years, especially after she picked up a run of small manufacturing clients in the early years that most of her competitors overlooked. She automated everything correctly. Rung 1 through rung 5, on time, in order, exactly as I described last time. She had the float. She had the match, once she hired her first employee and could offer one. She paid off a business loan early rather than let interest compound against her. She built the real emergency fund, sized honestly, not guessed at. By any measure I gave you, Marguerite had done this right. By year 12, her practice was clearing more than most of the doctors and lawyers who walked into her office as clients. By year 18, more than nearly all of them. Every milestone should have been a moment to ask the question. None of them were. She told me once that she remembers exactly where she was, a diner booth, ironically, much like the one from video 1 when her accountant, her own accountant, the one she paid to watch her numbers, said, almost offhand, "You know you don't have to keep doing this at this pace." She laughed it off. Not because she disagreed. Because she had never once considered it a live question. There was a kitchen, too, in the small house she'd owned outright for over a decade, a stove older than her newest hire, a slow leak under the sink she patched twice a year instead of replacing once. Not because she couldn't afford to replace it. She could have replaced it 4 times over without the withdrawal ever showing up as a number she'd notice. She patched it because patching was the number she had always operated by, and she had never once sat down long enough to ask whether the number still described the woman writing the check. The leak got fixed. Eventually, the week her niece visited, saw it, and simply called a plumber herself without asking permission, the way you do for someone who has clearly stopped seeing the thing in front of them. And she never once used rung 6. Not because she couldn't. Because she never asked herself the one question that makes rung 6 possible: what number, specifically, is enough? Without an answer, more was always, by definition, better, and more is better, unexamined, is not ambition. It is a treadmill with the stop button removed. I want to be precise about what she did wrong, because it is easy to mistake this for a story about greed, and it isn't. Marguerite gave money away to her church, to a scholarship fund at the community college, generously, on a schedule. Generosity was never the gap. The gap was that even her generosity was uncapped, unexamined, running on the same treadmill as everything else, a percentage, not a number. A percentage of an ever-growing figure grows forever too. It never once forced her to ask what enough giving looked like, any more than it forced her to ask what enough keeping looked like. At 61, with a number in her accounts that would have startled her 28-year-old self into disbelief, Marguerite still ate lunch at her desk to save the $12 a restaurant would have cost. Not from need. From a floor she had never located, and so had never permitted herself to stand on. 26 years of rung 5, running perfectly, aimed at a target that was never named, which meant, in practice, that it was never reached, no matter how large it grew. Contrast Marguerite with a man named Desmond, who ran the parts counter at a farm equipment dealer for 31 years, a far smaller income, most of those years, than Marguerite ever saw. He never owned the dealership. He never wanted to. He knew, by his own account, more about hydraulic fittings and combined header assemblies than almost anyone in 3 counties, and he built no ambition on top of that knowledge beyond doing the job well and going home. At 35, Desmond did something almost nobody does. He sat down and wrote out, in specific numbers, what his life needed to cost for him to feel finished striving. Not a guess. An actual figure, revisited every few years as his life changed. He wrote the first version of that number on the back of a service invoice, sitting at his own kitchen table, because it was the paper closest to hand and he didn't want to lose the thought before he'd committed it to something permanent. He kept revising it, a child born, a mortgage paid off, a diagnosis in the family that changed what health needed to mean in the number, but he never once let it go unnamed for more than a couple of years at a stretch. That habit alone, revisiting a number he'd already written rather than avoiding the whole exercise a second time, is most of the difference between Desmond and everyone who tries this once and quietly gives up. When Desmond's number arrived later than he expected, but it arrived, he did something Marguerite never did. He stopped. Not stopped working entirely, but stopped optimizing past the number he'd already named. He kept the job at the parts counter 2 more years after he could have walked away, because he liked the men he worked with and the seasonal rhythm of it, but he stopped picking up the overtime shifts he used to take without thinking. He took his grandchildren to the coast every summer, the same 2 weeks, booked a year ahead, non-negotiable on the calendar the way a mortgage payment is non-negotiable. He replaced a truck he didn't strictly need replaced, because the old one rattled on cold mornings and he decided, in advance, that this was exactly the kind of thing his number was for. He gave money to a nephew starting a business, while he was alive to see it used, rather than after his death when the gift would only be a number in probate, a distinction he cared about more than almost anything else, he told me. The number was tested only once, seriously, about 4 years after he'd stopped optimizing past it. A distant cousin passed, unmarried, no children, and left Desmond a sum larger than anything he'd guessed his whole working life would produce on its own. Plenty of men take a windfall like that as a signal to raise the number, to decide, quietly, that finished must have meant something smaller than it turns out to mean now that more has arrived. Desmond didn't revise the number up. He revised it sideways, more for the nephew's business, a fund for a great-grandchild not yet born, the beach trip extended by 3 days instead of the number growing to hold on to the money for its own sake. The floor stayed exactly where he'd drawn it. Only what stood on top of it changed shape. Desmond wasn't less disciplined than Marguerite for 31 years. He was equally disciplined, aimed at a target he could actually name, which is the only kind of discipline that knows how to end a race instead of just running it. That is the entire difference between a floor and a ceiling you mistake for humility. The myth is that enough will announce itself, that at some natural point, a feeling of sufficiency will simply arrive, uninvited, once you've saved long enough, invested successfully enough, run the treadmill well enough. It will not. I have sat across from people with more money than they could spend in 3 lifetimes who could not answer the question, what is this all for, not because they hadn't thought about it, but because they had spent decades assuming the answer would present itself once the number got big enough, and it never did, because that isn't how the feeling of enough works. It isn't a temperature the account reaches on its own. It's a line you draw, on purpose, with a pen, before the number gets there, because they had spent decades building a ceiling-free ledger and never once, on purpose, built a floor to land on. One of those people, a man who'd sold a manufacturing business for a sum I won't repeat, told me he still felt, most mornings, like he was 2 good years away from being secure. 2 good years, after decades of good years already banked. That isn't a math problem. Nobody can solve that with better returns. It's the same missing arithmetic Marguerite never did, dressed in a much larger number, proof that the size of the ledger has nothing to do with whether you've built a floor underneath it. I've watched the same myth operate on people who by any reasonable measure had already won, twice over. The number in the account keeps performing the job of reassurance for a shorter and shorter stretch of time, the way a compliment stops landing the 10th time you hear it. That isn't the market's fault, and it isn't a failure of the strategy that built the number in the first place. It's simply what happens when the only floor you've ever built is, more than I had last year, a floor that, by definition, can never hold still long enough to stand on. Marguerite is not a cautionary tale about greed. She never wanted more for its own sake. She simply never did the specific, uncomfortable arithmetic that Desmond did at 35, an arithmetic that has nothing to do with income, and everything to do with naming a number out loud before life names one for you. Skip that arithmetic and it doesn't matter how well the rest of the system runs. You can automate 5 rungs perfectly and still spend your whole life on a treadmill you built with your own 2 hands, unable to explain why it never seems to end.
Here is the exercise, in 3 parts. First, write down what your life costs today, specifically, not a guess, the real number, pulled from your own accounts, this month's statements, not last year's memory of them. Most people who try this for the first time are wrong by a wide margin, almost always in the same direction. They guess low, because the number they're picturing is who they were 5 years ago, not who they are now. Second, write down what you believe your life will cost at the point you'd call yourself finished: housing, health, the version of generosity you want to practice, the specific things you do with your time once the striving itself is no longer the point. Be as concrete as Desmond was. Not travel more, which trip, how often, with whom. Not help family, which family member, how much, on what schedule. Vague numbers produce vague floors, and a vague floor is just a ceiling with better manners. Third, and this is the part almost everyone skips, write down what happens on the day that second number is reached. Not vaguely. Specifically. What do you do differently on that actual Tuesday? Do you actually stop taking the overtime shift, the way Desmond did, or do you keep taking it out of habit because stopping was never rehearsed, only imagined? Most people who skip this third part reach their number and change nothing at all, because a number without a rehearsed action attached to it is just a bigger version of the same treadmill. Desmond's third answer was concrete: fund his grandchildren's summer trips while he was alive to sit on the beach with them, watching them build something ridiculous out of wet sand instead of reading about it later in a letter from his estate. Marguerite, when I finally asked her this question directly, had no third answer at all. 26 years of rung 5, and no answer for what rung 6 was ever supposed to be for.
Write it on paper, not a spreadsheet, at least the first time. A spreadsheet lets you keep adjusting the formula quietly, in private, without ever confronting the number as a decision. It stays a variable instead of becoming a commitment. Paper forces the number to sit still long enough for you to actually look at it, the way Desmond's invoice sat on his kitchen table for a week before he did anything else with it. You can move it to a spreadsheet afterward, to track it, to revise it on schedule. But the first time, let it cost you the discomfort of ink. Revisit this number every few years. Life changes, a child arrives, a health scare rearranges your priorities overnight, and so should the figure. But the point is not precision. Nobody gets the number exactly right on the first attempt, or the third. The point is that a number exists at all, sitting somewhere you can see it, written down, dated, revisable, instead of a ceiling that keeps sliding upward every time you get close, staying permanently, conveniently, just out of reach. Someone watching this is thinking, isn't this just an excuse to stop pushing myself? It is the opposite. Desmond pushed for 31 years toward a target. Marguerite pushed for 26 years toward nothing in particular, which is a much harder, much lonelier kind of pushing, because a treadmill offers no finish line to organize your effort around. A floor doesn't lower your effort. It gives your effort somewhere to land. Someone else watching this is thinking, what if I name a number and then life changes and it's wrong? It will be wrong. Desmond's first number, written on the back of that service invoice at 35, was wrong by the time he was 42. He told me so himself, without embarrassment. A number you revise on purpose, in daylight, is not a failure of the exercise. It's the exercise working exactly as intended. The only number that stays permanently wrong is the one you never wrote down in the first place, because an unnamed floor can't be revised, it can only keep sliding, silently, the way Marguerite's did for 26 years. A third objection, quieter than the other two: what if I hit my number and discover I don't actually want to stop? Then you don't stop, but now you know that, on purpose, instead of assuming it by default the way Marguerite did for 26 years without ever checking. Desmond himself kept the parts counter 2 more years past his own number, for exactly this reason. The number was never a mandate to quit. It was a permission slip to choose, consciously, instead of drifting forward on momentum alone.
That's the ceiling you can't see, until you go looking for it on purpose. It was there for Marguerite the entire time, the same way Walt's was, built one reasonable decision at a time, never once examined because it never announced itself as a ceiling. It just felt, every single day, like more discipline. Write your 3 numbers this week. Not someday. This week, on actual paper, in your own handwriting, the way Desmond did on the back of that invoice. If you want to know what happened when Marguerite finally did the exercise, at 61, decades later than Desmond, whether a floor found late is still worth finding, or whether some ceilings, once built high enough, stop being worth tearing down, that's where I'm going next.